And lawless Scottish borders, and from the fertile lowlands, thousands of Scots emigrated in the 17th century to the north of Ireland. These Ulster-Scots or Scots-Irish built towns and roads in Ireland, and from a land of swamp and forest they created a rich province. But by the 18th century they were again on the move, this time to the British colonies of North America. The lands which were to become the United States. The people of Upper Octorara in Pennsylvania celebrate the 4th of July. Their Scots-Irish ancestors were in the forefront of the American Revolution, and earlier still, they were among the first of the pioneers to cut their way into the Pennsylvanian wilderness.
They've already started
The first pastor of Octorara Presbyterian Church in 1724 was Adam Boyd from Ballymena in County Antrim. The church has been the centre of a strong patriotic tradition since then. In the late 18th century, the gospel of revolution was preached here, and the soldiers for Washington's army recruited. American patriotism at Octorara does not conflict with a strong Scots-Irish identity. Most early immigrants from Ulster went to Pennsylvania. There, the Quaker government gave them the freedom of worship, denied them in Ireland. The first Scots-Irish settlements in Pennsylvania were along the Octorara Creek, which runs into the Susquehanna River southwest of Philadelphia. From here, they began to move in a northwesterly direction along the line of the Susquehanna, pushing the frontier deeper into the wilderness. Presbyterian churches, Upper Octorara, Middle Octorara, Fags Manor, Donegal, Derry, Paxtang marked the line of their advance. They found a rolling, fertile plain on the banks of the Susquehanna and christened it Donegal. After the first plots of land were cleared and the crops planted, they built a church. They built it beside a spring. There, on summer Sabbaths, with long morning and afternoon sermons, the worshippers and their horses could quench their thirst. Each church, as the pioneers advanced, was built near a source of sweet water and named accordingly: Donegal Spring, Middle Spring, Falling Spring. The Ulstermen seem to have found their promised land. Alongside the Ulster immigrants came German settlers. Today, their descendants, the Amish people of Pennsylvania and Virginia, live a lifestyle hardly different from their 18th century ancestors. The German and Ulster communities kept apart, the Scots-Irish occupying the hills because they thought the valley bottoms would be wet as in Ireland. The Germans, who knew better, got the best land. The Amish were hard-working, efficient farmers. Many of the Scots-Irish were ill-organized, lazy, and given to drink. The Germans were pacifists, their Ulster neighbours aggressive. There was little love between the two peoples. Most Scots-Irish were indentured servants like Arthur Patterson or John Smiley, who pledged themselves to 4 years of virtual slavery in exchange for a free passage to America.
Just imported and to be sold, Irish servants, men and women of good trade from the north of Ireland.
After working their indenture, the Scots-Irish set out for the frontier, 40 or 50 miles west of Philadelphia. There they began immediately to clear the ground for crops. The Ulsterman often claimed his land by tomahawk right. He cut his initials on a few trees, then cut a circle around the bark to kill the trees. The price for land was low, but to the tight-fisted Scots-Irish, that was academic. They refused to pay anything, saying God owned Pennsylvania, and he clearly intended it for Ulster Presbyterians. Life for the settler's wife was hard. She ground the meal to make cornbread. She spun the flax for the family's clothing. She worked in the fields beside her man. At the same time, she bore 10 or 15 children.
Your lessons. The minister's coming today. We'll eat a good book.
It was the settler's wife who educated the children, something which the Scots-Irish, no matter how far from civilization, thought very important.
Nathaniel Smiley, Burnhead Farm, Gatehouse of Fleet, Stewardship of Kirkcudbright, Kingdom of Scotland.
Clearing the land of trees was backbreaking, and there was a great temptation to live by hunting the wild turkey, deer, and bear which abounded. Unlike the meticulous Germans, the Scots-Irish felled the trees and ploughed round the stumps instead of clearing the land properly.
Bear meat.
Homemade whiskey was important at the frontier. When the settler was far from a market, he turned his extra grain into whiskey, which he then traded to passing merchants for guns and farm tools. Whiskey also made a harsh life a lot more tolerable.
Yo! Catching weight, mace, Johnny.
Aye, Arthur. We're staying in our jug for a while.
Johnny.
We want good music from you.
Shall we drop a rosin the bow? Here's to the old land and the new land.
God grant we hold hard to both.
How you doing, John?
The settlers longed for company, especially of their own people, still speaking Ulster dialect. Neighbours gathered to help clear land, build a house, or bring in the harvest. And a lively party resulted.
Mary, can I get you a big hand?
Aye, there's another bowl. Thank you.
Very well, John. I am indeed. How are you? Not too bad. Oh, how about yourself? Not too bad, boy. Here, have it.
Hello there.
How are you doing?
Thanks. Hey, bye.
Thank you, bye. 7 years since I came. I've 10 acres cleared and corn and 4 acres this year. Don't plant your corn to the dogwood flowers.
Indian talk. Who ever saw a good Indian crop?
Well, what about the Dutch then?
Oh.
Dutch! Every Sabbath our preacher goes on. Dutch, Dutch, Dutch. Nobody like the Dutch. With their fields all cleared and their big fat cattle.
I'm sick hearing in Kirk about the Dutch working from dawn till dusk every day bar the Sabbath.
Right, you got a preacher.
Everybody well.
How are you?
How are you? How are you?
How are you?
How are you doing? Hello. We're sacred. The eyes of all wait upon thee, and thou givest them their meat. How's it all been?
Oh, not too bad.
You cleared any new land at all? That's good, that's very good.
Everything you can imagine.
That's really helpful.
Enjoy that. That's a drink up there.
The Ulster pioneers were an extrovert people given to drinking, arguing, singing and dancing. The broad horizons of America and their new sense of freedom gave a fresh exuberance to their Calvinist natures.
Down by the riverside, I cast my eyes around me, and an Irish girl I spied. Her cheeks were red and rosy, and coal-black was her hair. How costly were the jewels my Irish girl did wear.
The fiddler Arthur Patterson is buried in Donegal churchyard among the Petons, Andersons and Agnews of the first Ulster settlement. Their younger sons and daughters moved on to new lands. With the eldest son inheriting the family farm, they had no choice. Today, the broad Susquehanna is a pleasure ground for Pennsylvanian holidaymakers. But in the early 18th century, it was a barrier which halted the Scots-Irish pioneers. Beyond the river lay the rich, empty Cumberland Valley. Near present-day Harrisburg, a ferry run by an Englishman, John Harris, provided a passage, and the Scots-Irish poured in great numbers into the Cumberland. The Cumberland became the Scots-Irish heartland. By the time of the American Revolution, 90% of the valley population was from Ulster. The historian Wayland Dunaway called it the seedbed and nursery of their race. But in the Cumberland also, they suffered worst during the Indian Wars. James Logan, colonial secretary of Pennsylvania, was a Quaker from Northern Ireland. He had his own reason for promoting Ulster immigration.
We are apprehensive about the Indians. I therefore think it might be prudent to plant a settlement of such men as formerly so bravely defended Londonderry. Such people, if kindly used, will be orderly and easily dealt with.
Time was to prove how little Logan knew his fellow Ulstermen. The Indian threat was very real. The tribes were allies of the French, who owned Canada and claimed the interior of the continent. When war broke out between France and England, the Indians made a determined bid to drive the settlers into the sea. Logan's plan worked out. The Scots-Irish on the frontier formed a cordon round the English and Germans and took the brunt of the Indian attacks. Charles Stoner, Cumberland Valley historian, now owns the dairy of the weaver, James McCulloch. McCulloch settled in the Cumberland in 1750. During the Indian Wars, dairy entries about ploughing and reaping are side by side with accounts of his neighbours being killed or kidnapped by Indians. On the first page of the journal, McCulloch's fare from Belfast is recorded, but the entries soon move on to grimmer matters.
John Craig, Richard, and John Cox were taken by the Indians February 11th. John Cox escaped from the Indians August the 1st, 1756. I did begin to plow corn June ye 23rd, 1755. Had day reaping wheat July 12th. Did get it all in July 19th.
August 27th. A very great slaughter at Putmock by Indians, wherein 39 people were killed and taken captive, and 7 killed, loading a wagon in a field.
This was a favourite Indian trick. They hid in the woods until the harvesters laid down their guns and started work. Then they attacked.
August 28th. Cropper killed, and his daughter taken away. John and James McCulloch was taken captive by the Indians from Connachajig, July
the 26th, 1756.
1756.
At first, the Indians had the upper hand. They killed 50 settlers for every Indian killed.
At the ready! Fire!
The Ulstermen hit back. They trained in Indian tactics such as firing on the run. Commanded by ministers like John Elder of Paxton, they fought the Indians with equal ferocity.
What these savages have done to us is beyond description. Our homes have been burned, our wives and children murdered, or taken away to an unspeakable fate. Let me tell you this. Only the other day, the corpse of a young Christian woman, on the way to be buried in consecrated ground, was taken from her coffin by these painted heathens and scalped. And what about our good friends, our Quaker lords and masters in Philadelphia? What do they say? They want us to reason with the savages, to understand them. I have a message for those gentlemen who are safe in Philadelphia. We understand the Indians, and we know how to deal with them.
Elders Rangers, known as the Paxton Boys, raided a settlement of peaceful Indians and slaughtered everyone, including women and children. The Paxton Massacre blackened the Scots-Irish reputation, but it also shattered the complacency of the Quakers. Philadelphia author Dennis Clark.
The Scots-Irish experience on the frontier was again an experience laced with tragedy. There was a certain cultural bankruptcy that took place of people who went into that situation. So even though Americans glorified the frontier experience, it was crude, bitter, and the Scots-Irish particularly were engaged as protagonists of a form of warfare with the Indians that is hardly distinguishable from racist genocide in the mind of modern America.
From the Cumberland, the Ulster settlers moved south to Virginia. Some settled along the Shenandoah River. Others moved on to the Carolina Piedmont. In the second half of the 18th century, they dominated an 1,100-mile frontier along the Appalachians, from Pennsylvania to South Carolina. This had a profound effect on American politics and folk culture. The land in the upper Shenandoah Valley between the Blue Ridge and the Appalachian Mountains was divided between two big land grants. In the 1740s, these lands filled with Scots-Irish coming down from Pennsylvania: the Lyles, the Lusks, the Trimbles, the Houstons. Timber Ridge, where the Houstons lived, was one of the original settlements, and the manuscript left by Samuel Houston gives a vivid picture of life in pioneer days. Herds of bison grazed broad stretches of the Shenandoah, already cleared by Shawnee Indians before the settlers arrived. These provided an abundant meat supply, and their skins were used instead of blankets. Pioneer homes were squared log cabins with enormous fireplaces which could burn whole logs. Cups and plates were made of poplar wood, and just as in Ireland, each home had its weaving loom for making the family's clothes. Augusta Stone Church in the Shenandoah was built like a fortress as a refuge against the frequent Indian attacks.
They came over the mountains on the head of Care's Creek and swept all before them, killing men and capturing women and children. The Gilmers, Hamiltons, and McKees particularly suffered severely.
At Tinkling Spring, 10 miles from Augusta, the pioneer spirit of the Virginian Scots-Irish is very much alive.
There has been a strong fellowship present on this land for many, many years, almost 250 years. The Reverend John Craig, an Irish lad of Scottish descent, served as the first pastor of this congregation. And the records of the baptisms that he did in 1740 to 1749 list names like these. See if they sound familiar. Mary Alexander, Mary Bell, William Caldwell, John Dunlap, William Lockridge, John Ramsey, Mary Thompson, and others, names of whom are members of this congregation right now.
In the early 1740s, the Presbyterians started pouring down here. My family came in 1744 and settled on South River, which is about 17 or 18 miles from here. And they were, like all the Scots-Irish in this area, associated with this church. And in fact, my great-great-grandfather was an elder in the church. He was Charles Patrick, who for a long time was a prosperous farmer up there and very active in church affairs.
Philadelphia was the pivot of the Revolution and a centre for Scots-Irish radicals. The Calvinists of New England fired the first shots, but they were soon joined in rebellion by the Ulster Presbyterians of Pennsylvania. Before the rousing notes of Yankee Doodle had sounded the call to arms, the Scots-Irish had taken control of Pennsylvania from the Quakers by means of revolutionary committees. After 2 generations in America, they were convinced that the city of brotherly love was not their idea of the city of God. In these committees, controlled and manipulated by Scots-Irish demagogues, the framework for American independence was created. The draft Declaration of Independence was received by the Scots-Irish President of Congress, John Hancock, and by the Congressional Secretary, Charles Thompson, who came from County Londonderry. And there were 5 Scots-Irish signatures on the final document, which was printed by John Dunlap from County Tyrone. The County Down-born philosopher, Francis Hutcheson, was a key figure in the Revolution. He never set foot in America, but his doctrine that a colony had the right to revolt against the tyranny of the motherland was taught here at New London to the young men who were to be the political and military leaders when the time came to take up arms against Britain. Hutcheson's disciple, Francis Allison, who emigrated from Donegal in Ireland, ran the school at New London Church. Among his pupils were several who later signed the Declaration of Independence. People like Charles Thompson and Thomas McKean, the Scots-Irish soldier and statesman, who grew up on a pioneer farm a mile from New London. The Scots-Irish Covenanters of Middle Octorara had a political faith as stark as their church. This new land of America, they believed, was covenanted to God and the British must be driven from it. Under the witness oak, which still grows beside the church at Donegal Springs, the sons and grandsons of the Ulster Frontiersmen, who had created the township half a century earlier, pledged themselves to revolution. Community after community of Scots-Irish in Pennsylvania and Virginia did the same. Even the tiny settlement of Hannestown in the wilderness of western Pennsylvania prepared to fight. Today, Hannestown, which was burned during the Revolutionary War, has been rebuilt as a folk village.
Most of the people here were Scotch-Irish by birth, but there were some Germans that came in later on. All in all, they were a very independent type of people here. And when the word came to them that the British had attacked Lexington and Concord, they decided they would never let a thing like that happen to them out here. So they got together and formed their own militia. They elected their own colonel. They made their own flag. And they wrote their own Declaration of Independence, which was about a year and a half before the big Declaration of Independence was written in Philadelphia.
On the 13th of July, 1782, Indians, led by British officers, launched a surprise attack on Hannestown. They burned the village, but failed to capture the fort. That day, most of the inhabitants were at a wedding in a nearby settlement, and they were killed or captured before they could reach the stockade.
party returned after burning and destroying Hannestown and country for 7 or 8 miles around. Killed between 300 and 400 head of horses, cattle, sheep. Also killed 15 of enemy. Took 10 prisoners.
Elizabeth Brownlee, born in the city of Londonderry in Ireland, taken prisoner in Hannestown, Westmoreland County. His claim to your late husband's pension. He was in the Revolutionary Army.
Captain Joseph Brownlee, 8th Pennsylvania Regiment.
On July 13th, 1782,
the day the savages came, hundreds of them, painted, stripes like horns. They came out of the woods, screaming. We all ran. Joe was carrying me, John and I had the baby. All the neighbours were running too.
And then?
The savage caught Mrs. Hannah and she shouted, Captain Brownlee. That very instant, the savages jumped on Joe. And they killed him and the wee boy. Like they were hogs.
You and your baby were taken away. Mrs. Brownlee, you're dreaming. Let's try again. The savages wanted to kill you.
I was in. They were tired of me. They wanted sport.
Did you say the officer saved you?
Captain Lottridge.
Oh, yes. Lottridge. One of your own Irish people. A loyalist renegade.
He said, sell her for rum.
And they did?
They sold the baby and me at Niagara for $20 and 2 gallons of rum.
The Scots-Irish of the Carolinas were slow to join in the revolution. Living a free, robust life in the backcountry, they felt little need of highbrow ideas like liberty and equality.
The earliest settlements in the Carolinas were along the coast and up the navigable rivers. But by the middle of the 18th century, the flow of immigrants from Pennsylvania down the Shenandoah Valley and westward from Charleston and the Carolina ports had begun to fill the Carolina backcountry at a remarkable rate. The region supported a unique kind of agricultural life, a combination of simple farming and a heavy reliance on livestock. The agriculture of the region did, however, permit rapid economic growth and considerable prosperity. So a very lively and robust backcountry society began to come together, even though in the eyes of travelers such as Charles Woodmason, it was a rather depressing and shocking kind of life.
Charles Woodmason, a prickly Anglican minister who worked among the Scots-Irish, saw the first signs of the trouble ahead. British intelligence officers moved into the backcountry to check rumours that radical agitators from the north were at work there.
Hey, come here, come here. Hey, come here. Come here. Hey, bloody holy Jew.
Mr. Woodmason, your servant.
Down priest, son of a bitch.
Wench,
Sir?
Hollands. Bear's oil. Oh, these people. Covered with it. Singular. Now, Mr. Woodmason, your help. Here. At the head of PD River and Lynch's Creek, a very fruitful, fine spot. A garden east of you. But it is occupied, sir, by the lowest, vilest crew breathing. Scots Presbyterians from the north of Ireland. It's all the same in the back country. Full of beggarly Irish from Belfast or Pennsylvania. Waxhaws or...
You don't know what to talk about.
Here. Whores, drunkards, cattle thieves. The government, Mr. Woodmason, is well aware of the general situation. Can I tell you something of a delicate nature? Of course. When I came here, it was thought unseemly that I should remain unmarried. There were rumors, tavern talk, you understand. To put an end to the slander, I told them from the pulpit my reason. The great tragedy of my life. A horse, sir, was the author of my misfortune. Kicked me in the scrotum and rendered me unfit for nuptial rites. I told them my story, expecting sympathy and understanding, and what did I get? Laughter, sir. Coarse, vulgar laughter from the whole congregation. In the Lord's house, holding on to each other, falling out of the pews. It is obvious I am an English gentleman. Quite obvious. I have held a King's Commission as a justice, and yet I am powerless. But what are they doing, Mr. Woodmason? What are they doing? A rambling set of fellows comes every year preaching treason. What sort of treason? Treasonable treason. Against the church, against the taxes, against the government. Give me details. Details, it's all details. Why do they jeer at me? Make their dogs bark at me, beat their drums when I preach? Why? I came to save you. Poor Irish people. Rock trotters. Scum!
Ulster immigrants continue to flow into the Carolinas. The Belfast newsletter announced the departure of 500 families of Covenanters led by the Reverend William Martin. Martin's party settled in Chester County, South Carolina, and he preached at a church with the unlikely name of Catholic Presbyterian. The Covenanters had emigrated to get away from political troubles, but they were soon drawn into the growing rebellion in the American South. After 5 years of war, there was something approaching stalemate. The Americans were largely victorious in the north, while in the south the British took control. The British commander in the south now prepared a master plan to win the war. With Georgia and the port of Charleston in his hands, his armies would thrust northwards through the Piedmont, outflanking the American Patriot strongholds in the coastal plain. His route would take him through the seemingly quiet Scots-Irish heartlands. A British force led by the notorious Banastra Tarleton caught up with an American guerrilla band at the Waxhaws, close to the Covenanter settlement. Although the Americans tried to surrender, the British troops killed or wounded every one of them, even pulling away the bodies to bayonet those underneath. The following Sunday, Martin told his shocked congregation, "It is time to fight." Growing up at the same time in the Waxhaws was a boy called Andrew Jackson, the son of a weaver from Carrickfergus in Northern Ireland. The Waxhaws massacre turned him into an American rebel and shaped his whole subsequent career.
Captain Jane?
Andy?
They had taken Tommy. Dragoons, hundreds of them.
Tommy.
We tried to juke through Kane's Creek, but Tommy's mare got stuck, and a big soldier in a red coat come up and hit Tommy with a sword. There, Cousin Jane. Tommy's not hurt bad. Cousin Jane? 'Tis like me, Cousin Jane. We'll hang Tommy as a rebel.
Whoa. This way, man. Come on, sit Bill. Sorry, scum.
You Irish brat. Come here and wipe this damn swamp mud off me boots. You heard, Irish brat?
I'm no servant. I'm a free American.
This way, men.
40 years later, Andrew Jackson, the politician, swore he spoke those very words. As the British Army marched into the Carolina backcountry, their commander, Lord Cornwallis, sent a force under Major Patrick Ferguson westward. They were to subdue the Scots-Irish territory along the Blue Ridge and to protect the left flank of the main army in the march north.
Here in the valley of the mountains, there were a large number of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians. Ferguson followed up the edge of the mountains and sent word over to these men that were in these valleys that if they did not stay out of the revolution, that he would come over and lay waste to their country by fire and rope. Now these words angered these men, and they sent out word all through the mountains for people to gather at Sycamore Shoals. They were angry not only that he had threatened to bring war and to bring destruction to their homes and danger to their wives and children, but they were also quite upset over the words that he had used because they felt that he had blasphemed. And so they determined that they would set out to get this man that was their military enemy, but even more so, a man that they felt was an enemy of God. And after 12 days, they finally found Ferguson waiting for them at a place called King's Mountain.
Bobby Moss, whose family fought on both sides of King's Mountain, described the battle.
This mountain, which runs almost directly east and west, is a very narrow mountain ridge. It is so narrow that in some spots, a man walking down the center of the ridge
can be struck by a rifle ball fired from either side. It was not the proper place to bring men who were to be used in the British system of massing men and using the bayonet attack. However, it did have one major advantage to the British. At its western end, there was an outcropping of rock where men could be placed as snipers. The American rebels could not do much in removing Ferguson and his men from this mountaintop until the snipers were removed from the snipers' den. Once the snipers had been driven from their position behind the rocks, the British forces were driven down into this general area of the mountain. It was here that they were able to mount their first bayonet attacks. They were successful in driving the Americans down off of the mountain ridge, but no sooner would they drive the mountain men down than they would turn and come back up. It was in this general area where a great number of the casualties took place. As the battle raged on, several attempts were made by officers to surrender, and each time a white flag was lifted, Ferguson rushed forward and cut it down. But finally Ferguson realized that all was lost, and so taking two of his officers, he attempted to escape down the east ridge of the mountain. And just as he reached the edge of the mountain, at least 7 marksmen struck him. He was dislodged from the saddle by the blow of these large bullets, but one of his feet hung in the stirrup. It was here that the Americans and 1 or 2 of Ferguson's own men found him. They released his foot from the stirrup, and it was at this spot that he died.
At Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, when the American cause was at its lowest ebb, the settlers from Ulster were the mainstay of the Patriot Army. At that point, Washington declared, "If I am defeated elsewhere, I will make my last stand among the Scots-Irish." After the British defeat, the Scots-Irish remained radicals opposed to the conservatism of the first American governments. A few, however, reached high office. The elegant Harriton House, home of Charles Thompson, symbolizes these success stories. Thompson, who began life as an indentured servant, virtually controlled the United States administration in the early years. As Secretary of Congress, he was the perfect civil servant, recording everything but keeping embarrassing matters from the press. He designed the Great Seal of his country, an eagle holding both arrows and olive branches, thus anticipating the United States' future role as a somewhat threatening peacemaker. It was through his efforts that the American Constitution was ratified, and before he left office, he handed to Washington his appointment as first United States President. John Smiley fought through the Revolution, became a congressman, but remained a radical until his death. James McCulloch rescued his elder son from the Indians. The younger was never heard of again. Elizabeth Brownlee died aged 84 without receiving her pension. Young Andy Jackson survived the Revolution to become one of America's greatest presidents.